Very good.
I had not heard that 160, and many more still listening.
Oh, yeah.
Many more.
Yeah, it was quite the event. Quite the event. Luke chapter number 12 is where we'll be. Luke chapter 12.
I love seeing that Mavericks tractor trailer haul out with all that water.
Yeah, yeah.
That was great.
Yeah, a lot of volunteer stuff happening in the volunteer state right now. Luke chapter 12. So we spent several weeks on Jesus healing the paralytic man, which is only recorded in John. It's the only record we have of that event. And so it took us a while to study through it because there's a lot of record there. And we actually didn't cover every single verse. But we got through the greatest majority of it. So we're not going to go back and cover that. We're going to pick it up on the next piece of the timeline, which is there's going to be a theme. So does anybody remember what day of the week it happened to be on when Jesus healed the paralytic man at the pool of Bethesda? The Sabbath day, yeah, and that caused quite the stir when, how dare that man take up his bed and walk and carry his bed on the Sabbath day? And we went through that together. So, but there's a theme, and the next set of passages is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So they all three, the Lord had them capture a record of this next event. And not everything's like that. We know that some things only one gospel will have a reference to, like the one we just studied. But this is one that is very common. There's a singular theme over the next couple of events that we have, and it started with the one we just studied, and that's the healing on the Sabbath. So we'll read some verses. We're going to read through all three accounts, and then we'll do most of our studying actually out of the book of Luke, but we'll just read all three accounts real quick. So Luke 12, and I'll pick it up in verse number 1. Did I say Luke 12? Luke 6, I'm sorry. I was looking at, yeah. Luke 6. It's Matthew 12. We're gonna go backwards through it. We'll do most of our studying in Matthew. Can't get my mind to think straight. All right, Luke 6. Now that's going to be a lot better. It says.
Are you saying you're ready for fall break?
What? Who? What is a break?
Big wheels don't get breaks.
What is a break? Yeah, my mind's already thinking of a few things I need to do when I get home tonight. So, but I'm not going to think about that. I'm going to think about this. And just get my mind to quit. So Luke 6, verses 1 through 5. It says, "And it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first, that he went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked the ears of corn and did eat, rubbing them in their hands. And a certain of the Pharisees said unto them, Why do ye that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days? And Jesus answering them said, Have ye not read so much as this, what David did when himself was a hungered, and they which were with him, how he went into the house of God, and did take and eat the showbread, and gave also them that were with him, which it is not lawful to eat, but for the priests alone? And he said unto them, that the Son of Man is the Lord also of the Sabbath." So there's the event. It's a very short record. Luke doesn't give us a very deep, long, drawn-out process, but he gives us a very narrow scope. So let's go and study it 2 more times, and we'll pick up whatever's different in. So we'll go backwards 1 more book. So back to Luke. From Luke back to Mark. Goodness, I promise we're going to get through this one way or the other. Mark chapter number 2. And you'll find it in verse number 23. So and it came to pass that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began, as they went, to pluck the ears of corn. And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And he said unto them, Have you ever read what David did when he had need and was an hungered, and he and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the showbread, which is not lawful to eat, but for the priest, and gave also to them which were with him. And he said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not the man for Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. So same story, a few other details. Mark, kind of gives us a little bit more of this is an Old Testament event when David is really fleeing at this point in time in his life, and he and his men are hungered, and they didn't really have any other options, so they stopped in where Abiathar was at, and they got the bread that had been set aside for the Lord's portion, the table of showbread. We studied that a long time ago, but that was not supposed to be just given out for the public to eat. The priest would eat that, or it would be offered unto the Lord and not used for anything else. And Abiathar gave that to them to eat, and he's using that as a context clue to try to drive us point home. Matthew has the most detailed account, so that's where we're going to do our studying at. And I am right this time. It is Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, and that's where we'll have our greatest time looking at this. So we've read it twice now, and this time we'll slow down and kind of pick it apart and bring some points. The reason, if we were to go back in time 2 studies ago, when we were looking at when Jesus had healed that paralytic man beside the pool of Bethesda, and we took a educated guess at the festival or the feast that was happening in Jerusalem, because John records that it was a time of feast in Jerusalem at this point in time, but he doesn't name it. So this context clue is where theologians and others kind of say that was probably around the Feast of Purim, because it was a time of harvest. And that's what we're seeing here when they go through the fields, that things were ripe unto the harvest. And these disciples were able to pluck them and eat them, consume them for nourishment, because they were ready. They were there. So that's how we came to the conclusion before that the previous one was around Purim, and it's from this context clue. So let's read chapter 12, verse 1. At that time Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungered and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. Now, we've read that a couple of times, and we've not read really anything different, but let's put ourselves in their shoes right now. So if we're living in first century Middle East, in Israel, very much we're still 100% under the law, and the law itself has really kind of replaced God in some regards, that we now worship the law more than the lawgiver. And a lot of things have been instituted that were really man's creation. God gave very clear ordinances and very clear commands for man to understand that he was not going to be able to keep them. It wasn't for the fact of keeping the law in order to become righteous. The Lord says, this is who I am. This is how perfect I am. And why you're going to need me is because you can't meet these criteria. Well, if a very terrible analogy, but as a culture or as a religious tradition, it was almost like, all right, well, I see your hand and I'll raise you one. Well, if you're going to give me this many, I'm going to just double it, you know? So if this many is good, I'll make it even more. And there were some very, very, I guess, prominent principles that were established in God's law, but again, it was the bigger picture idea, which Jesus is going to explain as we read through Matthew's account, is like you've missed the point. It says, man was not, and we're going to read this verse, he's going to say, man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath for the man. He said, you're really missing the mark on this. So here was the piece that was in contention. What were these disciples doing right now that is going to cause the Pharisees, in verse number 2, it says, but when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. What were they doing? Harvesting. Yeah. You know, and so they saw them plucking an ear of corn off, and not corn like what we imagine corn today, but it would be a grain. So corn is a grain. I mean, it's not a vegetable. But not corn on the cob like you're going to the farmer's market, okay? So they're not going to have that. Some people say, well, it's probably more barley-like, but a grain that could be harvested and could be consumed. And so they plucked one off, and they were going to eat that. And the Pharisees were like, whoa, you just broke all the rules. You just have thoroughly messed up. If you're a disciple, I think this is a good time to maybe just imagine for just a minute. So this is the tradition you've been brought up in, right? Yeah. But you're following a fellow that well, he told that guy to take his bed and walk, and evidently, if he said that was okay, who are these guys? So if I'm hungry, is this okay for me to take something to eat? I wonder, and the Bible doesn't say, this is just a pure sense of curiosity maybe y'all can add to. Do you think they asked him first? I don't know. It doesn't say. It doesn't say Jesus said, go ahead and get you something to eat. He led them through the field. We read those words. It says, and Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn. Why, sure he knew what they were going to do. Yeah. They're flesh. They're hungry, right? And so for what purpose? Is he, and I'm asking you these questions somewhat rhetorically, but really to just drive the point or drive the conversation. So is this an example where the end would justify the means? And the answer is no, because that's not the point here. The end is not what justifies the means. Jesus is going to make a very clear point of who he is and why, knowing full well the response of those around him, right? So, could he have led them to break the law? I mean, we've learned from Brother Kuthan through the years that to break God's rules is to what? Sin. Oh. Did Jesus lead them into temptation to sin? Oh, the quandary, right?
We're supposed to rest on the Sabbath day. Did they consider this work?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, did they?
So,
Rest on the Sabbath.
who's...
If the kernels had been in a bowl, it wouldn't have been a problem.
Yeah.
The problem is
They broke it off, yeah. Yeah. Oh, why, sure, yeah. I mean, eventually, I don't know at what point some of the rules that I think that, we've, I guess, just learned in church through the years, at what century were they implemented? Was that, so for instance, right now on a Sabbath day in Jerusalem, can you ride in an elevator? Yeah. Or how many flights of steps can you go up currently?
Actually, we were in Israel.
Yeah.
There were specific elevators for the Jews, and all the mirrors inside were turned.
On the Sabbath day. Yeah. So things have progressed through the years, is what we're saying. There's some things that we look at today that a current law that they follow that wouldn't have been established in Jesus' day. Their rabbis have continually developed application for new technology, right? So it is an evolving thing. And at this point in time, how many years had there been that it has evolved since God spoke with Moses on Mount Sinai and said, all right, Moses, here's my Levitical law. And so we've got a couple of hundred years, no, a couple of thousand years now, that it has continually been added to and expanded upon well outside of the context of what it was given in.
Right.
And how long did it take for that to happen? Well, God goes back and he tells a story about David. Now, David was a man that, he didn't know Moses, but he wasn't. This would be an interesting study if we had time to say, was David closer to Moses or to Jesus? And I would say David was maybe closer to Moses than he was to Jesus. I don't know. I've not studied that at all. Right now, if I ask you, for those of you all that may be a little more seasoned, you're welcome. That the same distance from this year to 1980 is the same distance from 1980 to 1936. That sounds weird, doesn't it? So time is something that kind of escapes us sometimes. That it's not like, wow, really? So in this methodology, Jesus is speaking to the here and now and the actual true intent of the law. So we have to come away with a couple of understandings. Number one, Jesus could not have led his men into temptation. Why do we know that? Well, it says that in the Bible. I will in no wise, let me paraphrase, but he says, I'm not the one going to use sin to tempt somebody, And so he wasn't leading these men into an act of sin, because that would be an impossible thing for God to do. Not because he's not has enough power, but he said, I'm not going to do that. He'll tempt men in the word temptation, which we give it a really different connotation than its true meaning. It just means, the ability to make a choice, is what temptation is. You're offered with the ability to make a choice, and God is not going to lead somebody to sin.
So it's correct to say in his eyes, they didn't break the law, but in the Pharisees' eyes,
in the Pharisees' eyes, they broke the law.
Is it because of the Torah, the one that the book of laws that they used, was that in that particular book?
So what you've got is well, let's go back to the basics. So if we just look at the Ten Commandments, what commandment are we looking at for this day, for this specific event? Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Now they have made their own definition of what does it mean to keep it holy. And so if this was like week by week, last week, well, if you carry your bed on Sabbath day, you're unholy. And Jesus' response was, so to heal somebody is an unholy act? And I'm just paraphrasing what we've read. So now today, we've got this Sabbath day, and some men have broken ears of nourishment off, corn, barley, whatever, a grain. I said, oh, y'all broke the law. And he says, so to feed someone that's hungry is an unholy act? And he challenges them with something that they were very familiar with. He says, well, you remember the story of David? Let's read through. All right, so now that we got that framing, right, let's read through that. Verse 3. But he said unto them, have ye not read what David did when he was an hungered? And that they were with him, how he entered, and they that were with him, and how he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law how that the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Oh, now he really put it back on them. How would a priest profane the Sabbath day on the Sabbath day? Well, what were they doing on the Sabbath day? Our pastor can testify to that. That's a pretty busy day. You know, we don't celebrate the Sabbath day, the seventh day of the week, but we honor God's resurrection on the first day of the week, and people use that as a pattern, right? So customarily, we would say that that we take Sunday and honor the Lord with that, and we try to limit our work on that day for that reason. Not that we can't work, but that's the tradition that we see the example of in the Bible. But that's his most busy day of the week. Last week was my most busy day of the week. So now, what position does that put us in? So he's using, he said, listen, guys, which way you want it here? You want your cake and eat it too, right? But you can't have it. And he used two great examples. So looking at David's example, so in verse number 3, we read this already a couple of times, the story of this event. David and some men are fleeing, and they have to leave without anything. They leave with nothing. And escaping, they're like, man, we need something to eat. We're about to pass out. We're about to pass on. And so they stopped here at the it's not a temple, but a place of worship, because the temple wasn't established, but a place of worship for what now? No, it wouldn't be a synagogue. Well, was it in Gibeon? Because it could. I've not studied this. If you're on Facebook, I've not. Just the house of God, right? I've not gone back and studied this event in David's life. This is all memory, which is scary. We shouldn't do from that, especially after what you saw tonight. I can't even get you the right book of the Bible. But they were worshiping God there and providing sacrifice, and the showbread was very much dedicated to that work of the Lord. And the Lord actually said, "This is for this purpose." And David took that and ate that. Actually, Abiathar gave it to him, and to sustain him, to bring him really life, because he would starve to death. That was the thing, that he wasn't at death's door, but that was where they were headed to. And then he uses the example of the priest. He says, and then on the Sabbath day, you guys break a sweat. Y'all are sacrificing and offering and doing different things, and he says this to them, and then we'll read a few more verses here. In verse number 6, he says, "But I say unto you, that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if ye had known what this meaneth," he says, "I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless." And then he says these words, "For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day." So, if we look at this at a 10,000-foot view, here was the challenge that they were faced with right now. There was a lot of rules and laws that they had been given, Levitical code, that they had added to. And at this point in time right now, they were worshiping the law more than the lawgiver. He said, you've actually taken this idea of a day of rest, a Sabbath day, and it now holds a higher esteem than the one who told you about it. And that's why he says, if you would have understood this, that I would rather have mercy than what? Sacrifice. He said, you've missed God's intent here. That my intent, he could have phrased it that way. He said, my intent was the fact that for you to understand, yes, who I am, but the fact that I am a God of mercy. But you have flipped the script. That you now elevate the idea of self-denial and sacrifice and those kind of things more than the mercy of God. Well, so with that flipped, let's take that, if we could just take a parallel and move that over into Ephesians chapter 2, it would say, for ye are saved by your works because of what you've done. He says, here's the intent: mercy, sacrifice. Move that into Ephesians. For by grace are you saved through faith. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast, right? So that's the parallel, and they've done this with it. Then he gives them those words. He says, and this, remember, his name for him, the Lord, Christ here on earth, God in the flesh, lots of names in the New Testament, but his primary personal description, Son of Man. And we've studied that a couple of times, and the overarching intent here says, I am the one that is both have the authority and the righteousness to accurately judge all things. That has been given under my charge, and I will judge one day. And let me tell you, I'm over the Sabbath day. I am the Lord of the Sabbath day. You've missed the mark. Well, as custom would have it, how much endearment did that make him with those of which he spoke this to? They didn't love him even more for it. Now, I won't say to add insult to injury. I'm not going to take you back and forth because it's almost time to close tonight. Matthew reads, and I think we've got enough time to read this. So it says in verse number 8, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. The day that you've now exalted even above Jehovah, you now worship the day more than the one who created this for you. I'm Lord over that person as well. Verse number 9, it says, and when he was departed thence, he went into their synagogue, and he's about to actually perform another miracle, right? Let's not read deeper in that story, but let's kind of go backwards or go forwards now. So go to Mark chapter 3. And we'll wind down in Luke here at the very end. Mark chapter number 3. So the very end of Mark 2 that we've already read once, therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. And verse number 1 of Mark, and he entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man which had a withered hand. That'll be our next event. Let's look very lastly at Luke's, just that very transitional part right there. And it's Luke chapter number 6. So remember, when we see differences, it doesn't mean that one's wrong. It just means that one has I just can't say it enough. Different perspective. We just got to keep that in mind. People really get tripped up on, there's a difference right there. Well, yeah, there's a difference because you got three different people from three different viewpoints, some of them firsthand. Matthew, very likely, could have been literally there watching it happen. Mark and Luke were not. Their information came from firsthand accounts, and all of them under the direction of God's Spirit in writing the gospel. So ultimately, this is how God wanted them to record it. And so when we see differences, it helps us see that there's different viewpoints, but it's still the same message. So anyway, I say that because in Luke chapter number 6, verse number 6, it says, "And it came to pass also on another Sabbath that he entered into the synagogue and taught." So Luke's record here kind of gives us a little bit of a clue that we may not see in Matthew and Mark's record, in the fact that, when we read Matthew and Mark, I always had this envisionment that they were going through the cornfield and picking, and then went right into a synagogue, and added insult to injury, for lack of better terms. But it doesn't really read that way, and I think that's an important thing to not overlook, in the fact that we see constantly where the Lord is not trying to isolate the Pharisee. He is challenging them with the truth, but not for the purpose of saying, stay away. He's not going to circle away from the truth of, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. But now we get to Luke's gospel, it says, and then on another Sabbath day. So, can you see him? To me, that's a great picture of mercy, because he very, very easily could have done all these things, just bam, 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 and have totally, what's a good word here?
Discouraged them to where they didn't want to follow.
I can't think of a better way to describe it, Miss Joyce, to absolutely, to have browbeat them, alienate them. And he says, I didn't come for that. I came to what? To seek and to save that which was lost. And that's everybody. Now, again, he wasn't turning his back on the truth and challenging their beliefs, but I get this bigger sense of mercy, not sacrifice, Oh, I want you as much as anybody else here, but I know you're having a hard time with it, but I'm not. Just because you're having a hard time, I tell my students in school all the time, somebody that doesn't love you won't correct you. So when I say that's wrong, it's not because I'm mad. Now, it might frustrate me, and especially if it's dangerous, somebody's about to get hurt. But for me to just say, live your life as you wish, it'll all be okay. There's nothing worse I could do for a person. And so, it just, even in this context, the Lord is challenging them with, I healed somebody on a Sabbath day. Take up thy bed and walk. How dare you take up your bed and walk? These men have a real need. It's okay that they plucked some barley off this to eat. It wasn't that they were harvesting the field in order to sell it for a crop, in order to make money off of this thing. I think at that point we would have crossed the line over, that is outside of what you should be doing. But you're trying to take care of a very physical and immediate need. What is the phrasing he would use a little bit later in the New Testament? The ox in the ditch. So which one of you, if you didn't have an ox in the ditch on the Sabbath day, wouldn't get him out, right? And so he's building that case. And then, we've not read the next story where he heals the hand, but again, it's on a Sabbath day. And for a long time I thought, well, it's just, we came through the field and went into the church. But Luke kind of gives us that little tidbit, and on another Sabbath day. He's constantly just trying to draw them to himself. So anyway, thank you for being here and adding to our conversation tonight. Anybody got any comments or questions that they want to share?
I just wanted to say, disciples, how we have some are more conservative than others.
Yeah.
Saints, I wonder what the sect they were in weren't as strict on the Sabbath, maybe.
Well, you got one disciple that he was joined up with the Romans. So, right? At that point, he had been banished from all of his friends and family.
Another thing I was going to add is the Pharisees. I always wondered this, if the 400-year disciples,
Yeah.
if that's where they got
a lot of things got
A lot of things got
added to it.
closer
Yeah.
because they were hear from God. That's what they were trying to get. They're
So
trying to get closer, and the more you, further away you get from God, the more you try to
take it upon yourself. So,
find yourself.
yeah, brothers. I'll say this again just for people on Facebook. Brother Faust was saying that his curiosity is like, I wonder if during that 400 years of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that Maccabean period, if that's where some of these, what it may appear to be over-the-top type laws were added, were they added there because people were creating a replacement God because they were filling in a gap for themselves, you know? So, I don't know. Great question. And we still do all the time, you know? We still do. We make our own righteousness when all that's said and done. Well, let's pray together. Lord, we come to you and we thank you for this evening.